increasing income and yet trying to conserve forests and biodiversity. This may be just one part of the puzzle, and it's a puzzle that I think we've been ignoring up to now. It's also a puzzle that gives rights to certain indigenous and local populations that have also been not acknowledged. I just wanted to say there are many different kinds of these systems. Many of them feature other fruits. Many of them feature fast-growing timber species. Many of them feature other kinds of species. On that graph, which I don't have much time to talk about, it shows us sort of an increasing forest cover in certain areas of especially the Brazilian Amazon, of the floodplain. And there are actually almost all of these municipalities, there is an increase in forest cover, and that's been happening for quite a long time. This is from earlier on, but it's still happening. And a lot of it has to do actually with the increased cultivation of acai, for example, and it's actually replacing cattle pastures in certain areas, especially of the floodplain in the estuary. You can see in 1985, the red stuff sort of shows you areas of acai, heavy persistence, to some extent, management of acai, and you can see that's Brazil. And that's obviously just the estuary of Brazil. And this marks the municipalities that produced acai in 1985. And if you look at 2004, you can see that acai has actually spread to many parts of the Amazon floodplain where it never existed before. There's actually another species of acai, the euterpe palm that was common there, but they're being replaced by this palm. But again, in many of these municipalities, you'll also see that there's an increase in forest cover, and much of this has to do with acai. And it's Euterpe oleracea is the acai palm. The other one that's sort of more common higher up on the Amazon is Euterpe precatória. And it's, by local people, it's been used for a tremendous number of different things. You can see these on the right, we have certain uses. In the middle are the different parts of the palm, and they've been used for many, many different purposes. And it's been a palm that has been managed for a long time. Right now it's being used, only the fruit basically is being harvested in this for this international market, but the quantities, the incomes and all that have been coming out of some of these areas are now much higher than it used to be. So this, just extremely briefly, I should be sitting down already, but I won't until I tell you a little bit about how you can actually produce one of these acai-rich forests in many different ways. One is basically to sort of follow a shifting cultivation trajectory, which is sort of selective clearing, often leaving some trees, then usually starting with some annuals and semi-perennials and planting in acai already. And also, there's acai all around. It lives in these forests anyway. So also managing a lot of natural regeneration. And then gradually, managing it for more and more acai, and you basically come out with an acai agroforest. And I can tell you, if it's managed by smallholders, it tends to have many other species in there because people use many of these things also for their own, for their other uses. But there's another way of doing it. Basically, if you have some unmanaged forest, although it's difficult to even figure out what's unmanaged, then there's a whole trajectory of thinning, transplanting more acai, not getting rid of everything else, but transplanting, thinning some of the stuff that's there, pruning it, and eventually coming up with something that's also very similar. But again, it's basically started as a forest, it stays as a forest, but you manipulate it. And probably now that the market has increased much more, there's a lot more acai and less of other stuff in there. But in any case, you arrive in this way in various other places. Now there's also, you can see some of these other trajectories which are much more sort of an industrial agricultural level. And if you look at this, it looks very different. There's really nothing between these very much. The diversity is quite low. It still gives you tree cover, but there's much less diversity. But in these, you'll find, and we found that not only do you have rather high plant diversity, because people also tend to be managing for other things, but also quite a lot of animal diversity as well. I'm going to have to stop talking about this, but there are three different, so there are these sort of acai forests, there are acai fallows that come from agriculture, there's acai planted in house gardens, and these households there tend to rely on all three of them at the same time. They tend to be managing them in many, many different ways. And these are the acai fruits, but people also sort of plant in, manage in this place also for fast-growing timber. This is Calophyllum sprucianum. There's lots of other things that are included there, and there's often a lot of animals as well. You can see here one of our prime farmers also shows that they have some rice in there, but they plant the rice really not for the rice, but because the rice attracts fish. And this is an area that floods, actually floods twice a day. And so this is really management for animals rather than for plants. There's not enough rice that you can make much of a meal out of it, but it does bring in fish. So there's multi-purpose management and high biodiversity. So again, just to repeat, this is just one instance of a traditional way of managing forests for food, an apparently sustainable way of doing it, and it's also quite successful in responding to new needs or new markets in this case. And there's much more I can tell you about it, but this is what we really want to focus on now, is whether it's possible to work with smallholder forest management, and not making smallholder forest management just something that follows sort of conventional forestry ideas, but follows these ideas that have been there for a long time, that you can manage both for lots of ecosystem services and manage for food at the same time. And this may also lead to more sustainable, not only more sustainable diets, more sustainable livelihoods, but also more sustainable landscapes. And with my apologies for going over, if there are any questions, perhaps I can do it very quickly, and then we can move on to another.
Thank you, Christine. Is there any question for Christine for this fascinating story? I think she made an important point that I think we have a lot to learn from these traditional ways of managing if we want to conserve biodiversity. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just would like to know if those forests, do they belong to the people there, or is it a government property?
In these areas of Brazil, actually, especially in recent years, there's been a lot of acknowledgement. There actually has been a good deal of granting of secure tenure to most of these folks. In other areas, there isn't, and as a matter of fact, it's very interesting, and this is something that Eduardo Brundizio has written a good deal about, with the expansion of the markets, for example. Not only is it, we actually see that the access is quite threatened, partly because there's a good deal of writing about how the people here don't know how to respond to market. If these areas of Brazil is going to participate in a way that will benefit the region in sales of acai, now that acai is so desirable on an international market, we can't possibly trust its management to these folks who've been sitting in the forest all along, because they may be they may sort of know that area, but they may know some of these resources, but they don't know how to produce for a market. They don't know how to manage. So there's some threat there. But largely, in this area, at least in the areas that we've worked in, we can actually see livelihoods being enhanced by this market change. Okay.
you showed municipalities where forest cover had increased. Is that largely attributable to monocultures of SE, or is it also?
Well, you know, some of it is, some of it are plantations, but still, from what I know of the estuary, especially in certain other parts of the floodplain, the areas still tend to be in smallholder hands, and most of it, you know, people talk about how it's just asaizao, it's just acai, but the truth is when it's managed by smallholders, it tends to be much more in there actually, and some of that increase in forest cover actually is a change from pastures, really. So that really changed, that really increased the diversity in all of the area.
Okay.
Excuse me, some question. Do you think this way to practice this? Do you have long-term plan about how many years to use this practice? Do you have plan, long-term or short-term plan, and how many years?
They do.
Yes.
You know, I mean, that's the point. People have been managing for a long time, and even though this is a somewhat new situation where the market has changed has changed extremely, people still manage to respond to it, largely using their own area, their own knowledge of this particular species and knowledge of management techniques. So there was a lot of saying, you know, we've got to come in and design management techniques. Among other things, this is an area that goes underwater twice a day, so it's difficult to argue that we really know how to manage it better. I mean, these are areas that tend to be probably labeled in land use plans as places where you can't possibly do agriculture because it's flooding all the time, and this is exactly where they do agriculture because it is flooding all the time. You know? So in this case, they seem to have been doing this for a long time and seem to be responding to these new challenges really quite well, using largely locally generated knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. I think you move on with another presentation from WWF on food sovereignty for food security, how protecting traditional knowledge and biodiversity can be part of the solution. These are from the colleagues who couldn't make it.
Okay, so I'm on behalf of Dr. Christina Egghenters, an anthropologist who's the Deputy Director of Social Development for the World Wildlife Fund in Indonesia. Christina sent both a paper and a presentation, and I'll largely read the paper and go through the presentation. And I'm a little lucky because I actually know many of the areas that Christina is talking about, so perhaps I can answer some questions, but I wouldn't trust me if I were you very far. But let me just begin and read this, and if you need any explanation, I'll try to do it. Okay, so she begins. As the summer news of drought in key production areas for corn and soybeans sparked global fears of another food price hike and raised concern of social unrest, which Terry talked about, and the dramatic impacts on poor populations, policy discussions around the world are once again poignantly real and urgent in many countries. Global demand for food is projected to rise by 50% by 2030. Also, the world is now consuming more than it's producing. This is according to Evans, 2011. Opinions differ on whether we already have reached a physical limit to agricultural production, i.e. the amount of arable land, or that the inefficiency and quality of food production and consumption remains the most urgent problem to tackle. But all seem to agree that the plunging trend in investment for agricultural research and technological innovation needs to be reversed. Okay. At the policy level, scarcity is regarded as the root cause. If at the possibility level scarcity is regarded as the root cause, then the overall agenda is driven by how to increase supply. Should we open more forests for cultivation, restore or convert low productivity or inefficient use areas like wetlands and peatlands to more intensive agricultural production? and dealing with short-term shocks and stresses by means of importation subsidies and other buffer measures at international and country levels. The approaches appear quite linear and logical. More people need more land to produce food. Another line of argument, and sort of similar in how it looks on the supply side, insists that breakthroughs in technology and resource efficiency are still possible and will be rolled out on a global scale. But the focus is on the need to curb demand. The question, if the focus is on the need to curb demand, the question is whose demands need to be limited. And the distributional equity side of the food security issue is probably the most difficult to deal with by technocrats and policymakers at all levels. So she raises the issue of what are the causes of food scarcity? Is it largely distributional? Is it basically production? And if it's this distributional, who gets it? What are the distributional and equity dimensions of food security? So it remains a complex and multi-level issue with regard to production, demand, and distribution. Yet all of these dimensions would need to be understood and deconstructed if sustainable and long-term solutions need to be identified and adopted. So for the point of view of ecosystem and biodiversity conservation, the food security debate is a very relevant one and in more than one way. WWF is increasingly recognizing in its work on commodities and footprints, equity and the governance of conservation landscapes is important. It centers around the meaningful and causal nexus of poverty, well-being, and consumption, traditional agricultural systems, resource tenure, and agrobiodiversity, including the following key risks and challenges. The risk of more land clearing and of ecosystem loss, the risk of biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, which can also mean the loss of food and cultural and spiritual values, the risk of land allocation to more profitable cultivation other than food and the dominance of big estates and land grabs, as has been raised here, distortions and inequities in tenure and governance models, the loss of traditional knowledge and practices associated with small agroforestry and agricultural regimes, and increased disempowerment and creation of poverty. So the risks are difficult. The risks are multidimensional. These linkages help profile another dimension of food security. It's not only a matter of quantity of food, but also diversity and quality of food, as has been mentioned before, and related cultivars, equally on the basis of sustainable and meaningful food and livelihood systems. Many of the edible plants that we consume have originated from forests and ecosystems. They have been managed and domesticated by the ancestors of local and indigenous farmers over time and have traveled across continents to become staple foods. It was the active experiments and practices of local people that have often shaped the variety of cultivars and diversity of food plants of our planet, and food sovereignty as a way to recognize rights and diversity and establish fair protection claims over the genetic resources that make up biodiversity is very much part of efforts to redress governance models towards more equity and sustainability. The high biodiversity tends to be a salient feature of traditional farming systems, and it is what is referred to as known as agrobiodiversity. Local features of traditional farming systems high biodiversity tends to be a local feature of traditional farming systems. Agrobiodiversity, which was nurtured in very specific environments and microclimates, and has been influenced by cultural traditions and strong preferences. The result of surveys conducted by local people to assess aspects of actual biodiversity in the highlands. These are the highlands of the Krayan, which is in the very sort of central parts of Borneo, right on the borders between East Kalimantan, Sarawak, and Sabah, have shown that there are over 20 local varieties, for instance, of durian, one of it's a commercially and locally important fruit. And these durians have enough phenotypical and sensorial distinct characteristics to warrant a different name in the local language. So this is just one type of diversity, for instance, in fruit. In the same area, there are over 40 varieties of rice that are planted in any planting season, and again, many of them are particularly distinctive, and many of them commercially are very, very important. And in a study in 2 communities in Sarawak, in Malaysia and Borneo, just over the border from Australia, Christensen found that local people have a knowledge of over 1,144 species in 172 botanical families. And around 20 of these species are known and used in some form, whether in ways that are actually cultivated, or in many of these sort of semi-managed and semi-domesticated states. And over 50 of these species have multiple uses.